The 1994 Mr. Olympia wasn't just another bodybuilding contest. It marked the 30th edition of the most important event in the sport, carrying decades of history, sky-high expectations, and a rivalry that was already loaded with tension before anyone even stepped on stage. In 1994, Olympia wasn't just a title. It was the definition of what it meant to have the best physique on the planet. The competition took place on September 10, 1994, at the Atlanta Civic Center, bringing together the biggest names in the professional elite under the IFBB banner. For one night, Atlanta became the center of the bodybuilding universe, with thousands of fans locked in on every pose, every comparison, and every tiny detail on stage. The total prize money reached $275,000, a huge amount for the time, and a clear sign of the event's prestige. The champion alone would take home $100,000, along with the most coveted trophy in the sport. But that year, the money almost felt secondary compared to what was truly at stake: the future direction of professional bodybuilding. The 1994 Olympia happened during a quiet but deep transition. The physical standard that had dominated the stage for years was starting to drift away from classic aesthetics and move towards something bigger, denser, and more extreme. Most fans didn't fully realize it yet, but they were about to witness a historic turning point. And while the context alone was already intense, what really set the 1994 Mr. Olympia on fire was a direct clash between two opposing visions of bodybuilding. On one side, the push for extreme mass, wider frames, thicker muscles, and overwhelming presence. On the other, the defense of classic aesthetics, focused on symmetry, proportion, clean lines, and visual harmony. This wasn't just an aesthetic debate, it was almost philosophical. For many fans, bodybuilding had always been about balanced physical beauty, something close to living sculpture. For others, the sport had to evolve, break limits, and show just how far the human body could be pushed in terms of size and visual impact. On stage, that conflict was impossible to ignore. One head-to-head comparison was enough to make it clear that judging criteria seemed to be pulling in different directions at the same time. Who should win? The physique that looked the most shocking at first glance, or the one that revealed more refinement the longer you studied it? That question hung in the air with every pose. As the 1994 Mr. Olympia started to take shape, one name completely dominated the conversation: Dorian Yates. He arrived in Atlanta as the two-time defending champion, having won in 1992 and 1993, surrounded by the aura of an athlete who seemed untouchable. To many people, the title already felt decided before the first pose down even happened. The year before, Yates had stunned the world by stepping on stage at around 257 pounds, about 116.5 kilograms. It wasn't just the weight, it was the density, the thickness, and the sheer visual impact. His physique represented a brutal leap beyond the standard Olympia had known up to that point, fully cementing what became known as the mass monster era. But in 1994, behind that dominant image, the reality was far more complicated. Yates' preparation was plagued by a brutal series of injuries. First came a serious shoulder issue involving the rotator cuff. Then, a tear in the vastus lateralis of his thigh, which kept him from training legs for weeks and compromised the foundation of his physique. As if that weren't enough, just weeks before the contest came the most visible blow of all: a partial tear of his left biceps. The injury didn't just affect his training, it was clearly noticeable on stage, especially in front poses. For the first time, fans were seeing obvious flaws in a physique that once looked indestructible. And things didn't get easier on prejudging day. Yates stepped on stage dealing with illness, swelling, and water retention, which hurt his conditioning and abdominal control. At that point, an unavoidable question started circulating. How could such a dominant champion possibly win while fighting a battle against his own body? On the other side of the stage, if there was one name truly capable of challenging Dorian Yates' dominance in 1994, it was Flex Wheeler. After finishing as the runner-up in 1993, many believed he was destined to become the next Mr. Olympia. His physique blended size, symmetry, and flow in a way very few athletes in history have ever matched. Flex represented the perfect balance between the two worlds colliding at that moment. He had enough size to stand next to the mass monsters, yet he maintained classic lines, a tight waist, and elegant posing. For many fans, he was the ideal answer to the question hanging over the sport. Was it possible to unite mass and aesthetics at the highest level? But the storyline of that season was brutally cut short in June 1994. Flex Wheeler was involved in a serious car accident that left him with broken vertebrae in his spine and a fractured clavicle. The impact was so severe that, for a time, there was real fear he might never compete professionally again. With that, the Olympia lost its most anticipated showdown. Flex's absence left a massive hole on stage and completely changed the dynamics of the contest. Without him, the competition shifted toward athletes with far more extreme physical approaches, a shift that would directly influence the final outcome. And that's how one of the biggest what-ifs in bodybuilding history was born. What if Flex Wheeler had competed in 1994? What if he had shown up in shape similar to 1993? Those questions were never answered, but they're still debated to this day. While Dorian Yates was battling his own body and Flex Wheeler was out of the picture, one athlete stepped onto the Atlanta stage having the best showing of his entire career: Shawn Ray. In 1994, he didn't just look competitive, he looked almost flawless, as if everything had aligned for this to finally be his year to win the Sando. Shawn Ray had always been known for his elite technical level, but at that Olympia, everything clicked. His physique combined razor-sharp conditioning and dry, well-defined muscle with symmetry that stood out in every direct comparison. There were no excesses, no obvious imbalances. Every pose felt deliberate, designed to highlight the complete package. One of the most talked about aspects of the night was his midsection. To many fans and experts, Shawn Ray displayed the best abs of the entire contest: deep separations, a tight waist, and total control. At a time when many competitors were struggling with bloating and water retention, he looked solid, clean, and confident on stage. In direct comparisons, especially in front poses, Shawn Ray outperformed Dorian Yates on multiple occasions. Front double biceps, abs and thighs, and even the front lat spread clearly showcased Ray's aesthetic edge and technical refinement. It was impossible not to notice that, in those moments, the reigning champion looked vulnerable. And that's exactly where the controversy was born. For a huge portion of the audience, Shawn Ray had done everything expected of a Mr. Olympia. The question echoed inside the theater and beyond it. If this physique isn't worthy of the title, then what is? To understand why the result of the 1994 Mr. Olympia is still debated, you have to take a close look at the technical breakdown of the onstage comparisons. From prejudging onward, it was clear that Dorian Yates was not at his best, especially in front poses, where his weaknesses became more obvious. In poses like the front double biceps and abs and thighs, Yates was clearly at a disadvantage. The partial biceps tear disrupted his visual balance, while his midsection showed signs of bloating and reduced control. In those moments, cleaner and more symmetrical physiques immediately stood out to the audience. On the other hand, when the comparisons shifted to side and back poses, the picture changed completely. Yates' back width and muscle thickness were still on a level no other competitor could match. Even without the same sharp conditioning of previous years, his back continued to deliver instant, overwhelming impact. That's where the judges made their priorities clear. Despite the visible flaws from the front, they favored sheer mass, physical dominance, and overall presence. The criteria seemed to reward what shocked the audience the most, even if it wasn't the most refined total package. As a result, something important happened that night. Dorian Yates' aura of invincibility was shaken, but not destroyed. For the first time, the champion looked human, vulnerable, beatable. And yet, the final decision showed that, at that point in history, bodybuilding was willing to forgive imperfections, as long as size spoke louder than anything else. When the comparisons were over and the judging concluded, the top 6 of the 1994 Olympia made it clear how the sport was being evaluated at the time. At the very top, Dorian Yates secured his 3rd consecutive title, even far from his best form. The win reinforced the idea that, despite his flaws, his mass and dominance in back poses still carried more weight than any other factor. In second place was Shawn Ray, right at the absolute peak of his career. For many fans, he presented the most complete and refined physique of the night. The runner-up finish cemented his reputation as one of the most consistent athletes in bodybuilding history, but it also deepened the frustration of never having captured the sport's ultimate title. Third place went to Kevin Levrone, one of the most explosive physiques of the entire decade. Levrone stood out for his size and muscle density, but in 1994 his conditioning wasn't quite on point, especially when compared to the top two. Even so, his spot on the podium was never really in question. Fourth place was claimed by Paul Dillett, arguably the most visually shocking athlete when viewed from the front. Massive arms, broad shoulders, and a tight waist created an almost unreal look. However, limitations in his back poses kept him from having any real chance at the top. Rounding out the top six, Porter Cottrell finished fifth, representing balance without extremes, while Chris Cormier surprised everyone by taking sixth place in his Olympia debut, drawing attention mainly for his dominant leg development. While the top six gets most of the spotlight, the 1994 Mr. Olympia was also defined by important stories outside the top placings. One of them involved Ronnie Coleman, who finished all the way back in 15th place. At the time, he was still seen as a developing athlete, far from any kind of favorite, and almost no one imagined that he would one day become one of the greatest champions in bodybuilding history. Ronnie was still very much a work in progress. He lacked overall size, muscle maturity, and competitive polish. Even so, his appearance in 1994 is now seen as symbolic, the quiet beginning of a journey that, just a few years later, would completely redefine what it meant to dominate the Olympia. Another name that stood out was Charles Claremont, known for an extremely refined classic physique. Symmetry, clean lines, and flawless aesthetics made him a favorite among more traditional fans. However, Claremont became one of the clearest examples of athletes who suffered from the shift in judging standards, losing ground as the mass era took hold. Nasser El Sanbadi also made his Olympia debut in 1994. Interestingly, at that point he still displayed a relatively aesthetic and balanced physique, very different from the full-blown mass monster he would become in later years. His appearance marked the beginning of an evolution that would soon place him among the event's top contenders. Closing out this broader picture beyond the top six were Samir Banout and Sonny Schmidt, representatives of a generation that was slowly saying goodbye to the main Olympia stage. As soon as the results of the 1994 Mr. Olympia were announced, the reaction was immediate. Dorian Yates' victory didn't go unnoticed and quickly turned into one of the most intense debates in bodybuilding history. Inside and outside the theater, fans, athletes, and experts began questioning whether he truly had the best physique of the night. For many, the judging symbolized something bigger than just a title. It came to represent the official defeat of classic aesthetics, refined symmetry, and harmonious lines that had defined previous generations. In their place came the full coronation of the so-called mass monster era, where sheer size and muscle density seemed to matter more than visual balance. That perception grew even stronger when people looked at who was left behind. Despite years of consistency at the top and near-perfect physiques, Shawn Ray never won the Olympia. The same fate followed Flex Wheeler and Kevin Levrone, three athletes often mentioned among the most complete physiques in bodybuilding history. For many fans, 1994 became the symbolic turning point that explains why. The feeling was that, from that moment on, the path to the title narrowed to a single type of physique. It was no longer enough to be complete, beautiful, or technically superior. You had to be massive, extreme, and visually overwhelming. As time went on, it became clear that the 1994 Mr. Olympia was far more than a contest decided by scorecards. It cemented Dorian Yates as the ultimate symbol of extreme mass, an athlete who didn't just win titles, but permanently changed how the elite bodybuilding physique was imagined. From that night in Atlanta onward, the Olympia standard was redefined. The ideal champion became associated with width, thickness, and raw visual impact, even if that meant sacrificing elements of classic aesthetics. Training methods, diets, and contest prep strategies began to follow this new logic, shaping an entire generation of athletes. But that legacy has never been unanimous. The 1994 Olympia divided, and still divides, fans, athletes, and experts. For some, it represented the peak of physical evolution, the moment the sport pushed beyond human limits. For others, it marked the loss of something essential, the harmony, beauty, and original identity of bodybuilding. What's most fascinating is that this divide didn't fade with time. it carried on for decades. Whenever debates come up about aesthetics versus mass, fairness in judging, or what truly defines a real Mr. Olympia, 1994 inevitably finds its way back into the conversation. It became a reference point, a benchmark that's impossible to ignore. Because of all that, the 1994 Mr. Olympia went down in history as one of the most controversial and talked about championships of all time. Not just because of the athletes who stepped on stage, but because of the questions it left behind. After everything we've seen, one thing is clear. The 1994 Mr. Olympia wasn't just a contest. It was a turning point. A single night that changed judging criteria, redefined what champions looked like, and raised questions that still don't have clear answers today. Maybe you agree with the result. Maybe you think history should have gone a different way. And that's exactly what makes this event so unforgettable. Now I want to hear from you. Who do you think should have won in 1994? Did extreme mass get the justice it deserved on that stage? Or should aesthetics have prevailed? Drop your take in the comments, because this debate is a living part of bodybuilding history, and your opinion is part of it. If this breakdown helped you better understand this legendary moment, hit the like button. It really helps the channel keep bringing deep dives like this. And if you enjoy this more detailed kind of content, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. And if you want to support the project even further and get access to exclusive content, become a channel member. On the end screen, I'll leave another must-watch video from the channel that connects directly to this story and dives even deeper into this legendary era of bodybuilding. Click it and stick with us, because here, every video is another chapter in a story that never stops evolving.